Hey guys, what's up? It's Joe Dolajal here. Today I want to cover basically more detail and depth about astrological natal charts, or natal charts as they're simply called. If you guys remember, about 2-3 weeks ago I put out a very brief introduction about astrological natal charts, or natal charts, and basically what their purpose is, what their significance is, and why you should potentially look into getting one done for you, or get a reading done for you. So in this video I'm going to basically go into much more depth about natal charts. I'm going to cover basically what composes a natal chart, what the elements of a natal chart are, and hopefully I'll enlighten some people and it will stimulate you to get your own astrological natal chart reading. Okay, so first things first, what exactly is an astrological natal chart or a natal chart? The best way to describe it for somebody who doesn't know anything about this subject is like this. When you're born, basically there's an energetic signature imprint on who you are as a person, more or less placed on your mind when you come into this incarnation, into this physical body. And that's that imprint, that energetic imprint, is basically an exact reflection of where the stars, the celestial bodies were, the constellations, the planets were when you were born, when you came into this physical reality, incarnated in this body. Basically, those stars, those celestial bodies made an imprint on your mind, and that's basically who you are as a person. It surprisingly can tell you a great deal about your mental proclivities, whether they're good, bad, right, wrong, however society wants to deem them. It can tell you an extraordinary amount about your personality, and in many cases things that you're not even aware of, or maybe at best subconsciously aware of. So basically that's what natal charts are. They're basically a roadmap to who you are as a person. And what's phenomenal really about natal charts is that you can really delve extremely deep into a person's psychological makeup, and therefore their spiritual makeup, by really examining, re-examining, and going deeper and deeper and deeper into a natal chart. So for those of you who are new to this, and you do get a reading, sometimes the readings can last 30 minutes, sometimes 60 minutes, and sometimes they can go into 2 hours. But the reality about a natal chart reading or an interpretation is that they really are indefinite. If you can really pick one particular part about a natal chart and go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and really recognize things about yourself that either would maybe take you several lifetimes to recognize or realize, or things that you may know about yourself now but kind of had a subconscious inkling saying, oh yeah, I knew about that, but I didn't know it was that, or I didn't know it caused these types of problems. So anyways, just let's go through the line and let's really break down what a natal chart is. So if the first part, what I just said, didn't make much sense, just stay tuned and listen for the whole video, and I'm sure a lot of this will make much more sense as we progress down the line. Okay, so we basically covered what a natal chart is and why you should maybe look into getting an interpretation of your own natal chart. But let's look at basically the major aspects of a natal chart. There are 3 major aspects of a natal chart. There is house, there are the signs, and then there are planets. Every single one of these components are basically energetic frequencies, or they are basically a type or a band of energy that vibrate through you, basically emanating from the cosmos, vibrating through you, through your mind specifically. And then the byproduct is who you are as a person, your personality and your characteristics, the things you do, the way you believe, why you believe what you believe. It basically really is a full gamut spectrum marker, if you will, of who you are and why you do the things you do. So basically, let's go over the houses first, then we'll go over the signs, and then we'll touch on basically the planets and how these whole things intermingle, and then we'll end off basically tying them all in together so it really makes sense towards the end. So first things first, the first house. The first house is basically, it's a sign that's to the left of the chart generally in Western astrology. And the first house basically represents 2 things. It represents who you are as a person, who you basically like to express and show to the world, to the outside world, to the public at large, but also who you are as a person. Basically, it represents also your vitality, how you gain vitality about yourself. But most of all, it's also about who you see yourself to be kind of in your own mind, in your own heart. And without going into too much detail, we'll just cover each house very quickly like that. So that's basically the first house, that is the house of the self, as they call it. The second house is the house of money and material goods, and it also has a lot to do with your self-esteem, your self-worth, how you view yourself, and what are your moral principles sometimes. But at the same time, it also has a lot to do with basically your income, or how you earn money, or your financial status, your material status in this world. Now, it actually makes a lot of sense when I said it has a lot to do with your self-worth, your self-esteem, and also basically the principles that you hold in this world, because that is generally a direct reflection of the type of job you do, the type of people you associate with, the type of money you earn. It's an interesting house, and that house, the second house, can basically tell you a lot about those type of traits and characteristics of your personality. The third house is generally, it can be several things, but the third house is basically the house of the mind, as they call it. It can also sometimes mean short trips and studies, sometimes your environment and surroundings, but really the third house represents your mind, the mental proclivities that you have in terms of either the philosophies that you hold in life, the perceptions, the attitudes, the mental attitudes that you hold in life. And that's really what the third house in general represents when it comes to natal charts. So moving along to the fourth house. The fourth house is basically the house of home, of what type of family you have, what type of family, whether coming from your parents, your mom and dad, or on the other side, the type of family you have with your significant other, your spouse, or even potentially what type of family you would like to have, but may have not manifested yet. And so the fourth house really represents the house of the home, what type of home you like, what type of home life you have perhaps even had, what type of home life you will have. So basically the fourth house, that's what the fourth house represents. They call it the house of the home. Moving on to the fifth house. The fifth house is basically, again, there's several things, but the fifth house can sometimes be the house of love sometimes. Sometimes it could also be but predominantly the fifth house is the house of creation. That's really what the fifth houses will represent basically in your astrological natal chart. So what does that mean exactly in terms of creation? Well, basically, it's a display of the creative attitudes and the creative values you will hold in this life. Sometimes it could represent love affairs, sometimes, but not all the time. In other cases, it could basically represent things of a leisurely nature in you, how you like to spend your time, how you like to, basically the type of leisurely activities that you like to have for yourself, or basically the type of people that you like to integrate with in that sense. So we'll go more into each one of these houses as we move along, because as we go into the signs and then the planets, then they all do tie into each other, even though they're separate components of a natal chart. So it'll make more sense as we move along. The sixth house is basically the house of work. And also a lot of times the house of your health, about your physical health as well as mental health, but more the physical health, and also work. What type of work do you basically do? How you earn income, but also the type of work that you want to do in this life. So it can be both hands. It can be the type of career that you have, the type of work that you do or want to do, but at the same time, it can sometimes overlap and be the type of work that you wish to do, sometimes in a creative respect, like the fifth house was. So the seventh house is basically generally the partnerships that you have in this world between people. It doesn't necessarily mean intimate partnerships, although it can, but it also means the type of friendships that you hold, the type of energy that you hold in relationships between people of all spectrums, whether that's your boyfriend, girlfriend, whether that's your friend, deep friend, or even superficial surface friend, basically somebody that you know, an acquaintance that you don't really integrate with much, maybe even outside of work. But it also could represent basically marriages. Also, what type of relationships that you would have energetically with people that you would be that intimate with. So That's what the seventh house represents in essence. There's more factors to it as well. Sometimes people say that it represents law, legal matters. It can, but there's also other factors that play into that. But that's basically the seventh house. It's about union, marriages, contracts, what type of associations you hold with all the different types of people throughout your life. Another thing about the seventh house, like we were talking about the first house, because the seventh house is directly opposite the first house, is there's something called the descent in the seventh house. It's basically another aspect of you, but it's an important aspect because what the descent represents in you is kind of opposite and contrary but complementary to what the ascent in the first house represents about you. So in essence, if you remember what I said, the ascent in the first house represents who you are as a person, how you would like people to view you in a public eye. That's kind of what the ascent represents about you. But the descent is kind of who you really are deep down inside, behind closed doors, when the veil comes down and it's just you or very close people to you where you feel comfortable expressing the deepest intentions and desires of your heart. So the descent is very important in that respect, that it really does represent who you are inside, behind closed doors, when nobody else is looking, and maybe even secret tendencies that you would have about yourself that you could be conscious or maybe even unconsciously aware of. So that's really what the descent represents, which is part of the seventh house. So it's a very important aspect of natal charts as well. So moving on to basically the eighth house. The eighth house is probably one of the most interesting houses because it's a house of death and rebirth, also financial investment. It also could be a house of sexuality, basically the type of sexual proclivities that you have towards people or may find attractive in other people. It's also the house of passion and crisis. It can be something that is on the one hand very exciting, but on the other hand, it could be something that can destroy you. And it's almost like the moth flying towards the fire. The moth wants to look for heat, warmth, and light, and it gets excited and it flies into the very thing that ultimately ends up killing it. So it kind of has that energy. That's eighth house energy. And the gamut, or really to sum up what the eighth house really is, it is about death and rebirth. It's about transformation. It's a very intense house. So planets or signs that are in this house are going to have that component to it, which is something we'll get into again a little bit later, but it's something to keep in mind. That's what eighth house energy is. It is the house of death and rebirth. Again, sexuality as well. And in some cases, it can be financial investments, but not in all cases. There's other planets and signs that are that definitely have those type of characteristics, which again we'll get into a little bit later. So moving on to the ninth house. The ninth house is basically it is the house of travel, of sometimes abstract and higher concepts. It's also the house of spirituality, metaphysics. The eighth house, the ninth house, is a very interesting house in that sense that planets, signs, and placements or relationships to the ninth house will display those type of characteristics in a person. Basically, spiritual proclivities, also basically abstract, sometimes even very abstract thinking, also ideas, concepts, forward-thinking concepts, progressive concepts. These are all ninth house ideas and energies. Or it could be foreign travels. So basically, anything of a person that has placements in this can find themselves sometimes excelling in foreign countries. But again, that's basically the energy of the ninth house. It is the energy of spirituality. It can also be the energy of intuition, but it is definitely the energy of philosophy, spirituality, abstract higher thinking, and foreign travels. So moving on to the 10th house. Basically, the 10th house is the type of career you would like to have and should have and probably will have. The 10th house is basically like your social success, the type of career that you would aspire to, you would stay in for long term, and then eventually it's the way that you would want to be shown to the world, particularly in respect to career and work, and sometimes even money. Whereas if you remember, the ascent in the first house is more about how you would want to be seen as a personality, as who you are, as a characteristic, as basically how you want to be seen to the world for your characteristics, or as a person, maybe more in a informal sense. Whereas the 10th house is more about how you want the world to see you professionally. The type of how you would want people to see you if you were at your best, if you basically had entered into a career or an idea that you loved, you spent time in it, you mastered the trade, you became successful in the trade, and voila, that's how you would want the world to see you. That's what 10th house energy is. So it is basically that. There's also another important energy or concept associated with 10 houses, or the 10th house, excuse me, which are called North Node, basically. And this is something we'll get into a little bit later, so I'll just briefly touch up on it. Basically, it has a lot to do with what you should be doing in this life, which is called the North Node. But again, that's something that we'll cover in a little bit of a later section, because right now I just want to cover the houses. So, so moving on to the 11th house. So what is 11th house? 11th house is basically, it's the house that has the energy of the collective, of basically collective projects, collective support, collective ideas. Basically, if you're doing projects with friends or collaboratives with people you don't know, it can be a formal environment or an informal environment. It's basically, the 11th house is basically that house that has that energy behind it, which is the energy of the collective, of many people coming together to do an idea or to do a movement or to come up with a plan or whatever it may be. It's also the energy of humanitarianism, so that may give you a slightly better idea of what the 11th house is responsible for. So moving on to the 12th house. The 12th house is kind of an interesting house, and this is the house that houses, if you want to call it, Pisces. So it's okay if you don't know anything about that yet. Again, we're going to cover that in just a minute, but the 12th house is kind of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, and it's a house that's intentionally murky. It has basically the energy of who your enemies are, of the type of people that may be foes, or how would you say, difficult or cause nuisances in your life. And also sometimes that could reflect both ways. It's also representative of the difficulties that you may have in your life, also hidden ordeals and secrets about you, or how you handle secrets. That's kind of the more darker side of the 12th house. But on the plus side, the 12th house can be basically the energy of creativity, which is amazing. You know, some of the most I guess if you want to call it, some of the most successful artists have very strong 12th house placements. So very creative artists, very progressive artists have very strong 12th house placements, because it is a very creative house. It can also be a house of deep intuition, it can also be a house of spirituality to an extent, not so much as the 9th house, or differently than the 9th house. It can be as much as the 9th house, but this house in particular is definitely more deeper than the 9th house. The 12th house is more deeper than the 9th house, and it's definitely more mystical, more transcendental. Not that the 9th house isn't, but it's just more about the kind of stuff that you read in bookstores, the 9th house is, and the 12th house is kind of the deep stuff that you experience firsthand that would give you life-transforming experiences. That's what the 12th house energy really represents and is. So that's basically covering all 12 houses. We just did a whole circle and we covered all 12 houses. Next, we're going to get into signs, and then we're going to get into planets, and then we'll talk about some key components to natal charts, and stay tuned and we'll keep moving forward. So those are the 12 houses and the energies that correspond with each house. Every house has a sign and a planet that corresponds with it, basically. So in each house, if you want to look at it like that, there's actually 3 components. There is the house itself, the energy of the house, which we just covered. Then there's the sign, which is within that house. And then there's the planet, which is within that sign, that corresponds to that sign, which is within that house. So there are basically, like I mentioned before, 3 major components within a natal chart. And in the last section, which we just covered, we looked at all 12 houses and what energies correspond with them. But what are the signs? The signs, for the most part, as most of you may or may not know, it's basically the signs of the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac. And what are the signs of the zodiac? Well, energetically, what they basically are is you have a series of stars. And sometime in history, thousands of years ago, someone or a group of people or culture of people decided that a cluster of stars, which represent an animal or whatever it may be, the crab for Cancer, Aries for the ram for Aries, then they decided that a certain cluster of stars, which represented an animal, have a certain energetic signature collectively. And that energetic signature is basically the energetic signature of those stars of clusters, which is represented as a constellation or a sign, is basically what the signs are. And they do have unique and different energetic signatures. Each sign does, as each planet does, but each sign does more importantly. So that's basically, that is the basic idea behind a sign and why they differentiate between a planet and a house. As I mentioned before, each sign is inside a house and does correspond specifically with the house. So let's move forward and maybe you'll get to understand that a little bit better. The first house is Aries. That's basically, Aries is in the first house, if you want to call it that. And what Aries is as a sign, or if you know people who are Aries, they basically are very independent in many respects. They also can be leaders many times. A lot of times they're called leaders. A lot of times they are the people with the most, they have great initiatory skills, not sometimes the best finishing skills or getting through projects or ideas and seeing them all the way through, but they definitely are people who like to initiate things or have creative ideas or adaptive ideas. Sometimes they're people who are seen as people with great willpower, which goes back to the leader thing. So that is basically a lot of the energetic signature of somebody who's an Aries. There's one thing I want you to keep in mind, whether you are an astute astrologer or whether this is something just new to you, is that when a natal chart reading happens, there's actually 40 different simultaneous aspects to look into to discern the characteristic of a person. So when we're going through each one of these signs or planets, as we're going to be going through in a little bit, then keep that in mind, that these are just one part or one aspect of basically 40 or 40 major aspects within you as a person or as an individual. But that's basically what the constellation of Aries represents, generally speaking. So the sign of Taurus is a little bit different from that of Aries. The sign of Taurus can be basically that's more of a stable energy, in the sense that it's somebody who has stability in finances, stability in career. It also could be on the extreme bad end of it. It also could be somebody who is stubborn, sometimes ostentatious, not willing to compromise, and sometimes irrational because of that. However, that's generally not what is likely to happen, but it can be a characteristic of Taurus energy. The plus side of Taurus energy is that it is very, it has a lot of strength. It does have a sense of stability to it, and also there's a sense of sometimes compassion, a lot of compassion actually, until or if it gets into that to the realm of basically being stubborn. So the third sign which corresponds with the third house, is that of Gemini. Gemini represents the mind or duality, because we of course have two hemispheres to our brain. So it does represent that type of energy of duality, or basically, again, mental energy. It can also represent, basically, because of the mental energy, it could represent creativity. It could also represent publishing anything, books. It could represent publishing books, it can publishing YouTube videos or radio shows or whatever it may be. But Gemini is basically the energetic signature of the mind, particularly in the realm of duality and how that duality creates things. Because of that, sometimes it can be a little bit flaky, and sometimes it can be a little bit non-dependable, if you want to use that word. But for the most part, Gemini is a very good sign in the sense that it is a very creative sign. So that's basically that energetic signature, Gemini, which corresponds to the third house. Moving along, we have Cancer, which corresponds to the fourth house, of course. If you remember In the fourth house, we had basically that of family. We have that of the home. And Cancer is basically that. It's basically the crab that has the shell. What does that mean? It is basically a creature that likes to be protected in that sense. The shell is its home, so the Cancer energetic signature is basically an energetic signature of that. Again, it's that of the house. It could also be of your health sometimes. It could also represent home and family life on both ends. Again, your parents, mom or dad, or the family that you create or intend to create for yourself. So that is the energetic signature of the sign of Cancer. Leo, which corresponds to the fifth sign, is the energetic signature of basically that of a lion, which is what? It's basically that which wants to be seen, recognized. Sometimes it could be ostentatious or flagrant. But it basically is that sign or that energetic signature which wants to be seen and recognized, and sometimes it's the sign of popularity, of wanting to get recognition, fame, obviously. It can also be it could also have the energy of being honest in times of doubt, or being brave in that sense. But on the bad end of that spectrum, it could be sometimes bossy and a little bit annoying, because we all know that people who want too much attention, well, it goes without saying that can be a little bit of a nuisance sometimes. But that's the energetic sign of Leo. Moving on to Virgo. What is Virgo? Virgo, if you remember, corresponds to the sixth house of work, basically the type of work that you can do, sometimes in the career sense, yes, but also just the type of work that you like to do as an individual, or the type of work that you should be or ought to be doing. But Virgo has many different components to it. It's much more than just the sixth house that it's in. It can be basically a sign of pragmatism or being practical. It's definitely the sign of being organized or having things in order. But again, on the bad side of that, the far end of the spectrum, the other far end of the spectrum, where it becomes a nuisance, it can definitely be sometimes anal retentive, OCD, these types of characteristics where it verges from the realm of, I guess, what we can call normal or healthy, and can become more of an inhibitance or a nuisance to that person or people around that type of energy. So that's basically the energy of Virgo. Moving on to Libra. Libra is in the seventh house, which, if you remember, was the house of relationships, all types of relationships, not just boyfriend, girlfriend, but the type of relationships you have to other people. And of course, it could also represent law. So basically, the Libra energy is like the characteristics, and the energy of Libra is the type of energy which is very, it's kind of there all the time, paying attention, but it doesn't necessarily interact all the time. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of Libra can also be one of physical beauty. It's generally a very balanced sign, which is why, as many of you know, it, or may not know, but basically its sign is that of a scale in harmony. Why? Because it is a balanced sign. It basically tries to take the two extreme ends of whatever situation or relationship you're in and try to create a sense of balance or harmony within it. So that's more or less the energetic signature of Libra. Now, ironically, moving on to Scorpio, which is the next sign in the eighth house, that's almost the exact opposite of Libra, in the sense that it is a sign of, like we talked about, death and destruction, a very intense sign, a sign of intensity. It could also represent sex or sexuality. It could also represent sometimes very profound investments. It basically is the sign of intensity. If you think of anything intense or extreme, or cases of death and rebirth where somebody literally has to go through some god-awful stuff in life that when they're going through it, they don't see the benefit, but maybe in the outcome they can look back in retrospect and say, oh wow, that's why that happened. It all makes sense now. So that's basically the energetic signature of Scorpio. It is death and rebirth. It's a very intense sign. And that's in the sign of, and that is in the house, the eighth house. Moving on to Sagittarius. Sagittarius, basically being in the ninth house, does correspond with the energy of the ninth house, which is, if you remember, it is the energy of foreign travels, but also metaphysics. It's also philosophy. It's also spirituality. Not the deep stuff like the Piscean energy, but it nonetheless has that component and energy to it. And this the sign of Sagittarius, that's basically what it represents: foreign travel, philosophy, metaphysics, spirituality, all things of that nature, even abstract thought and abstract, even mathematics. It can be a progressive thought. And that, of course, is in the ninth house. So moving on to the next sign, we have Capricorn. What is Capricorn? Capricorn energy, basically, the easiest way to understand and explain Capricorn energy is because if you look at its symbol, which is a goat, then what does the goat do? It climbs the mountain slow but surely. If you remember in the 10th house, which is where Capricorn is basically, that's its natal house. That's where it is by default in the natal chart, or in the astrological chart, at least in the Western charts. Then basically Capricorn is the sign that it represents that of career. It represents it also could represent intuitiveness, but it represents your career and how you escalate in matters of career. It also is a sign of practicality. It also is a sign of maintaining stability, kind of like the Taurus energy was, but it's a little bit different in the sense that it may not be as stern as the Taurus energy is. And Capricorn definitely can be a sign of philosophy. Not as much as Sagittarius, not necessarily, and definitely not as much as the Piscean energy, but it is still a sign of philosophy, but maybe pertaining more to mundane or worldly matters. So again, that's in the 10th house. Capricorn's natal or native house is in the 10th house, and that's what that energy represents. The next one, which is the 11th house, is Aquarius, the sign of Aquarius. What is Aquarius? Well, if you remember, the 11th house had the energy of what? The collectiveness, or humanitarian. Basically, many people getting together to address, solve, or rectify problems on a collective scale, or sometimes even, sometimes it could not even necessarily be to correct problems, but to create new innovations. That's why sometimes they say we're going into the sign, the house of Aquarius, or excuse me, the sign of Aquarius right now. If some of you, again, that are maybe watching this and are familiar with astrology, they said, in the past we're coming out of the age of Pisces, going into the age of Aquarius. Why? Well, there's a whole story behind it. Why? Maybe I'll make a video why. But the point is, you see that we as a people, locally, nationwide, and also globally, are coming together and being connected more and more and more. And the distinctions and demarcations of people, whether it's racial, socioeconomical, or cultural, seem to be fading away, and everything is becoming one, or as a one world government, as some people, or as many people claim. Some people like it, some people don't, whatever. That's not the point of this video. The point is that is the Aquarian energy causing that shift from basically what we were experiencing the last 2,000 years into what we're experiencing now, and going through that shift. So Aquarian energy is that. It can also be innovation, but that's what the Aquarian energy is. It's definitely can be very creative, but it is an energy of the collective. And then the last sign is in the 12th house, Pisces, which is located in the 12th house. If you remember what I said about the 12th house, it's very intuitive. It can, on the, if you want to call it the dark end, it has those issues that we talked about how you address matters of secrecy, or sometimes it could also be things about like drugs, or any kind of basically that, not to get into that, but that can be the darker end of the Piscean energy. But the positive aspect of the Piscean energy, which is actually more relevant anyways, is that it is an extremely creative energy. It can be the energy of basically abstract artists. It can also be people who like to do things without ever getting credit for it, basically helping people unselfishly. They are very trustworthy. It's a very trustworthy energy as well. And it's a type of energy that doesn't necessarily need a lot of recognition when it does these acts of charity. Unlike, say, Leo, for example. If a Leo does something, or if that energy is involved where those acts take place, then it's going to want a lot of recognition, maybe sometimes even overkill in that sense. But nonetheless, it's a very nice sign. It's a gentle sign. It's definitely a sign of intuitiveness. Again, it's a sign sometimes of also deep perceptive abilities, not in the sense of the intellectual faculty as such, which would be more the Gemini energy, but this would be more of an intuitive, heartfelt, energetic ability to perceive things or to communicate things. So basically that was just a very short run through of the signs, and each sign that we went through and the houses that they correspond to, or basically the signs that are in what houses. So the next up is the planets and what they represent. Okay, so we covered houses, we covered signs, and now it's planets. Planets are probably the most pronounced, or yeah, I guess we could say pronounced aspect of the natal chart, meaning that they have the most influence, and how they play on each other, which is something called aspects we'll get into briefly as well, is a very relevant part of, the aspects are a very relevant part of natal charts. But planets by themselves are, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many astrologers, are probably more potent in terms of influence than the signs, and then even more so than the houses themselves. So we'll go, like we did with the signs, like we did with the houses, we'll go around the zodiac and we'll cover each sign. So the first energy, planet if you want to call it, is in the first house, which is Aries. Aries is Mars, basically. That's the corroboration there. So in the first house you have Mars. What is Mars? Well, Mars is many things. It can sometimes represent passion. It could represent war. It could also represent intensity or activity, not necessarily in the nefarious sense of war, but also just it has a tremendous amount of energy behind it, or the planet of activity, basically. So that is kind of just a very brief overview of what Mars is and the type of energy that Mars has behind it. And again, it's part of the first house. Moving on to the second house of Taurus, we have Venus. Venus is the house. It can represent many things. It could represent luxury. It could represent money, also health and physical beauty. It could also represent sexuality, but not necessarily intimate sexuality in the sense of, sometimes it can, but not in the intimate sense of, let's say, like the moon sign. The moon is more of the intimate, deep marital sexuality, where Venus can be a little bit more licentious, or just your one-night stand fling. That's what it can represent as well, among the other things that I mentioned. Again, Venus could also represent money. It could represent physical beauty, which I've already mentioned. And that's kind of the energy of the energetic signature of the planet Venus. So the next planet is that of Mercury. Mercury is in the third house, whose sign is Gemini. So what Mercury basically represents as a planetary energy is the mind, the intellect specifically. And that also has a couple of offshoots of it, because it's not just the mind, it is the mind, but it's also, it could represent contracts, it could represent travel, but it also represents certain aspects of the mind, like mental health. So that's kind of a very brief outline of what the planetary energy of Mercury represents. Moving on to the fourth house, which is Cancer, that is represented by the planet, the moon actually, excuse me, not the planet, but the moon itself. If you remember the fourth house, or Cancer, which is in the fourth house, it basically represents home or family. That's one of the major things it represents. It could also represent health in general, but that's kind of a slight sub context of that. But in this sense of the moon, it represents really your heart, your emotions, the deeper aspect of you. It can also represent intuitive abilities or psychic abilities, not so much like in the sense of abstract thought, but just that, if you want to say, motherly connection that women sometimes, a lot of times, have after they have children. Basically, it's kind of that they don't really understand why they have it, but they're always connected with their children no matter what happens. They know it when it happens rather than when somebody tells them it happens. So that's kind of the energy of the moon. The next planet, which is not really a planet, is the sun, which is in the fifth house of Leo, which represents what? How you shine, how you want to be recognized as a person. It also represents your vitality. The sun does. It can also represent the vitality, but also just your outlook on life. Basically, the sun placement and the sun energy definitely has a lot to do with your outlook on life, your perception. Mercury is more mental attitudes, mental proclivities, where the sun could be more about how you, through what lens you see those proclivities of the Mercurian energy. So that is an aspect there of, or just a very brief aspect of the sun. The next one, which is Mercury again, which is in Virgo, the sixth house. I'll just interject really quick. You may be wondering, why do they have, do they basically, some of the planets repeat in the signs? And that's because there are obviously more signs than there were planets, at least when astrology was originally initiated. And so a lot of times what you're going to discover right now going into Virgo, Mercury is actually used twice, and some of the other planets are as well. Anyways, back to what we were talking about. Mercury is in the sixth house of Virgo, which basically the Virgo energy, or the sixth house energy, again has that dynamic of the mental proclivities, the intellectual mental proclivities. Also just it can also be creativeness sometimes, again referring back to travel, and sometimes even contracts. That's the Mercurian energy. Repeating again for the second time, we have Venus, which is in the seventh house of Libra. Venus we already covered, but again it represents love, sometimes sexuality, health, money, also physical beauty. And the eighth house of Scorpio, we have basically Pluto. Pluto was designated as being the sign that corroborates with the energy of Pluto. Originally, before Pluto was discovered, however, there was Mars was actually always the planet of Pluto, but then that was changed after Pluto was discovered because, you know, for whatever reason, that's another history of astrology which we won't get into here. But nonetheless, Pluto is many things. Pluto could also represent death and rebirth, as the eighth house or the Scorpion energy represents. Definitely, and it does to the most part. But more than anything, Pluto is an amplifier. Basically, any planet, anything that Pluto gets involved with, or anything that it aspects to, which we'll cover aspects a little bit later right after this section. It's an amplifier of that energy. So Pluto necessarily doesn't, well, it does have an energy in itself, but it's more like if there's challenging aspects, it's going to amplify that challenge. If there are positive aspects or positive energies in certain planetary combinations, then it's going to make it that much better. It's an amplifier, really, is what it is. And sometimes it can also make things move along. Things that are stagnant, if Pluto runs through it or it aspects to those planetary energies, it's something that's going to either make it go or make it go away, or it's going to make it better, but it's something that'll also finish dead energies sometimes. But again, that's basically Pluto. The next sign is Jupiter in Sag, and that's the ninth house, if you remember. What was the ninth house in Sag? If you recall, it was basically foreign travels, it was metaphysics, philosophy, spirituality, and basically the cosmic perception, I guess you can call how you have of maybe the cosmos, or it's kind of like a big-minded idea, a little bit different than the Aquarian energy, but nonetheless it's Jupiter. Jupiter is a very favorable sign, maybe the best sign in terms of planetary energies. It's definitely a sign of good luck, good health, expansion, propitiousness, excuse me, I'm going to say that again, propitiousness, basically a favorability. It is really the sign of good luck, and anything that Jupiter touches or is in relation to, it's going to make it better, by virtue of basically expanding it in a positive way. So Jupiter is a good sign. Jupiter also represents good health, among other things. So moving on to the 10th house, excuse me, moving on to the 10th house of Capricorn, we have Saturn. Now, Saturn is probably one of the most misunderstood planets in many respects, because Saturn is the type of energy that if you go against, it can, I guess for a lack of a better phrase, destroy or challenge you to such an extent that it can seem almost life-altering. However, Saturn is also the planet that if you abide by and you embrace the challenges and the changes that the Saturnian energy is projecting, then it really is the type of energy that can make you basically evolve and advance to where you need to be and where your soul knows it needs to be. And that's why a lot of times, especially in the Vedic astrology, I know they call Saturn the kingmaker, because that's exactly what it is. It'll challenge you to such an extent that if you take the challenge, embrace the challenge, it's going to be difficult nonetheless. But when the challenge is done, you're going to look back and say, wow, I really grew as a person, as an individual, in whatever context or manner Saturn is basically influencing you. So Saturn isn't a good or a bad planet. It's a planet of rigidity. They say it's a very rigid planet. It's the planet of justice. It's also the planet, some people say it's the planet of death. I guess in a sense you can look at it as the planet of death. I think it's not a very well-founded term to apply to it, because death, yes, but why, is one of the questions you have to ask yourself. And sometimes death can be a good thing in the sense of maybe characteristics or personality traits of you need to die so that others can evolve and basically shine forward. Maybe things that aren't serving you anymore, things that are inhibiting you. So death in that sense obviously isn't bad, and Saturn is definitely responsible for that. Moving on to the 11th house of Aquarius. That house that house is basically is operated, or the planetary energy in that house is Uranus. What is Uranus? Uranus is an interesting planet. It's an interesting energy. Uranus is the energy, it's a good energy, but it's also an energy of restlessness and agitation, which basically means that it's something that can come along and push things forward to make them manifest, but it's also something that if it isn't bottled up and contained, it can cause problems and agitation, and sometimes even disruption. Some people equate the Uranus energy to basically the atomic bomb. So it's kind of like progressive, evolutionary. People are moving, they're discovering new things, and things are evolving. But then the end result of the atomic bomb was something that most people probably don't agree with, especially what it did to people, how much paranoia it caused across the world now that everybody's kind of at arms, and a lot of people that many people don't agree should have nuclear weapons have it, because it is a very intense energy, and it's an energy of sudden change. But overall, the Uranian energy, or the energy of Uranus, is a good energy, but that's one of the characteristics, is it can be sometimes uneasy, unsettling, but again, it depends in what context and what relationship to other planets it holds that ultimately determine that if it's good or bad in that sense. The last one, which is basically Pisces in the 12th house, is Neptune. Neptune is in the sign of Pisces, which is in the 12th house. The Neptunian energy is in a good extent a good expression or refinement of what we said earlier Pisces was, which was what? It was basically the type of quiet, creative energy that can do very abstract art, abstract music, abstract creations, also humanitarian efforts that don't necessarily need recognition. But the Neptunian energy itself is that and more. And it's more because it has a lot of dynamics in the sense that when it expresses itself, it can be very mystical, very spiritual, very metaphysical, very intuitive, extremely intuitive. People who have these types of placements, depending where they are in their chart again, they could experience sometimes intuitiveness that can be even disruptive to their life. Now, I've met many people who are like that, people who have asked me for readings, and even people outside of the astrology stuff, or even asking them for readings. You can kind of tell people who don't recognize this energy, who aren't aware of that they have it, sometimes by even picking up premonitions from other realities or other dimensions, if you want to call it that, if the Neptunian placement is strong in their natal chart in aspect to other intuitive energies. So it's, on that's the good aspect of it. And again, it's not a bad thing. It's all how you handle it. If you're aware that you have these type of proclivities, or you're aware that you have psychic abilities, and you address them and you try to tame them and you try to refine them and become aware of them, then they're probably the best asset you can ever ask for in this life. If you're not aware of it, and maybe if you're into substance abuse, which actually makes it worse or dulls it or kills that asset or that characteristic of you, then it can sometimes hinder you in the sense where this is actually why people do drugs. Sometimes we've all probably heard the story that we have individuals who are sometimes so sensitive to reality or to society that they have to, or they feel like they have to start taking narcotics or drinking because they're too sensitive to a lot of the injustices or iniquities of modern day everyday living. Well, that is actually what Neptune is if you can't handle those aspects of your characteristics, like basically being very sensitive, then what's going to happen is you're going to try to kill that energy because you don't want to deal with it, or you can't deal with it, or you don't understand what's going on. And then drug abuse or maybe alcohol abuse is involved, and that's kind of the downside of the Neptunian energy. Again, the upside is if you tame that energy, it is very, very good in the sense of psychic abilities, intuitiveness, even creativity. So basically that wraps up our basically dissecting what the signs are, or excuse me, the planets are. And then we covered signs, which basically corroborates with also the houses. There's one more thing that I wanted to cover, which we won't go into extreme detail here, but they're called aspects. What aspects are? Well, let me back up a minute. We basically had three major components of natal charts: signs, planets, and houses. That's basically, if you look at each of those as a ring, a circle, and a ring within a ring, they all basically move at their own pace. And the fact that each ring moves at its own pace causes dichotomies and discretions within how the planets, the signs, and the houses line up. That change and how, in what proportion they are to each other, what proportion the planet is to the house and what proportion the house is to the sign, is what creates aspects. And aspects are basically how the planets line up. Are they working with each other or against each other? If they're working against each other, it can cause challenges in your life in certain areas. And if they're working for each other, then these energies come effortlessly. We've all heard, oh, this person has good luck. Well, not necessarily. There's something in their planetary arrangement that is causing a seemingly effortless effort, if you want to call it that, that's giving them things that they don't necessarily have to work for, or that's giving the impression they don't have to work for. And that could be something in their natal chart that they're born with. We've all heard that. Some people are just lucky in certain realms of their life. And there's some people, sometimes it's only a window of luck, maybe 1 day or 1 week or 1 month, 1 year is extremely good for them, effortless. Everything just falls into place without effort. And that could be because there's a transition happening in their life, particularly for that year or that window, that's causing these types of things. And so without going into too much detail, that's what aspects are, is basically how the planets, the signs, and the planets, the signs, and the houses interact with each other, which is constantly changing every second, every day, every year, always, forever. So one more thing I would want to cover, which I think is probably the most important in terms of natal charts, is something called nodes. There are two nodes that you have in your natal chart, which is North Node and South Node. What the nodes represent are basically where the moon, they basically represent the moon and karmically what you should be doing in this life, which is represented by the North Node. And the South Node represents what you did or mastered in your past life. Now, that's extremely significant, especially in terms of navigating what you should be doing in this life. What are your benefits, your assets? What are your energetic assets? And how can you apply those things you've already done or are good at towards what you should be doing? Because after all, that's what every single person wants to do, whether they consciously know it or not. They want to be doing what they love to do, what they should be doing with things, with assets that they already have within them. And so that's really vital to look at when interpreting or reading a natal chart. Because when you look at the South Node, you can basically say, okay, these are the things that you perfected, you mastered in your last life, which is great, because by dissecting those characteristics, and maybe even other characteristics in the natal chart, you can say if you take these energies and you apply it towards what you should be doing, then life will just seem intuitively, psychologically, energetically, life will just seem better, in the sense that you may not have so much agitation within you, so much anger within you, so much fear within you, maybe so much questioning within you. What am I going to do? What should I be doing? And that problem right there generally will get solved when you do that type of stuff. When you look at the North Node, dissect it, understand it, and then start applying it towards the North Node. Again, the North Node is what you should be doing in this life to basically be a participant of the human race, of the human experience, if you want to call it that, through the specific benefit, the unique benefit that you can offer the collective whole, to basically not only make the collective whole better, but also make yourself better by way of cosmically evolving. So anyways, that was basically it. I hope you guys enjoyed this more elaborate video on astrological natal charts, or natal charts as we can call them now. If you guys want a reading, feel free to contact me. I left all my info below in the description box, and I will definitely do an in-depth astrological natal chart reading for you guys. If you have any questions, leave it in the comment section below. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time.